America remembers a girl on a lawn in 1958. 2 babies in her arms, diaper pins still stuck to her blouse. The wronged wife. The sweetest love story ever told, wrecked by Elizabeth Taylor. That photograph made Debbie Reynolds a bigger star than the marriage ever did. By her own memoir, she had already gotten her husband drunk to conceive the baby on her hip, hoping a child would hold together something that barely existed. He later wrote that he was their father only biologically. Within a year, her price per picture doubled. Nobody agrees who put those pins there. Start with the pins, because everything in this story runs through them. In March of 1960, a reporter named Pete Martin sat down with Debbie Reynolds for the Saturday Evening Post and brought up that picture. He told her she looked like a teenager who'd been kicked in the stomach. She said she remembered it very well. She'd taken the children out for an airing, come home, and found strangers in her house, reporters, photographers, people who apparently knew more about her marriage than she did. She'd just finished changing the babies. She wasn't thinking about how she looked. When she saw the picture, she said she was surprised to see a couple of diaper pins still attached to her blouse. 2 paragraphs later in that same interview, talking about the divorce year, she said something else. She said that flying home from Spain, knowing there'd be a crowd at the airport, she prepared a final statement in advance. Then she added, "It seemed like all she did last year was prepare final statements." Both of those things came out of the same woman on the same afternoon. One is a portrait of a girl too dazed to notice her own clothes. The other is a professional describing her media strategy. Other accounts don't split the difference at all. Writers describing that period say she gave interviews on that front lawn again and again, children on her hip, pins on her blouse, while the news crews camped out around the clock. Whether she pinned them there on purpose has never been settled. And honestly, it's the wrong question. The right question is why a 26-year-old woman whose husband had just left her was the only person in the triangle who never said a single thing she regretted. Elizabeth Taylor talked herself into a decade of hate mail in one phone call. Eddie Fisher talked himself out of a television career. Debbie Reynolds said almost nothing, and what she did say was written in advance. That's not the instinct of a victim. That's the instinct of someone who'd been trained. She was born Mary Frances Reynolds in El Paso in 1932, and the family moved to Burbank when she was small. A carpenter's daughter. No money. A mother named Maxine who ran a tight and frugal house. There's no Hollywood in the childhood. There's a Girl Scout troop and a strict church and a girl who entered the Miss Burbank contest in 1948. At 16, largely because contestants got a free blouse and a silk scarf. She won. Talent scouts were in the room. Within weeks, she had a studio contract and a new first name she didn't pick because the studio decided Mary Frances wasn't going to sell tickets. Understand what that meant in practice. From 16 years old, this girl's romantic life was partly a work assignment. Studios in that era arranged dates, planted items, paired contract players for premieres and photographers. Publicity wasn't a department that reacted to her life. It was a department that scheduled it. She learned early that being photographed was a job with a call time, and that the version of Debbie Reynolds appearing in the fan magazines was a product other people manufactured on her behalf. She also learned it in the least glamorous way possible. At 19, she was cast in Singin' in the Rain opposite Gene Kelly, and she wasn't a dancer. She was a gymnast who could fake it. She later described those months of training as the hardest thing she'd ever done, and she was not being cute about it. She came out of it with the discipline of someone who'd been thrown into deep water by people who outranked her and had chosen to swim rather than complain. And she lived at home. That's the detail worth holding on to. She told Pete Martin that she lived with her mother until the day she married, so she was, in her words, extremely inexperienced. She had to grow up very fast, and too fast, and she didn't recommend it as a method. Now, the other one. Eddie Fisher was born in Philadelphia in 1928, one of 7 children of Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire, in a house with real poverty and a father he'd spend the rest of his life describing without much affection. He had one of the best popular voices in America, and he knew it by the time he was 15. What he didn't have, in 1949, was a break. So a break was arranged. The story that made him Eddie Cantor discovering an unknown kid singing at Grossinger's, the great Catskills resort, and putting him on national radio, has been described since as a completely manufactured setup, engineered by Milton Blackstone, Grossinger's publicity director, who also happened to be managing Eddie. It worked. He went on Cantor's show, became famous almost immediately, signed with RCA Victor, and turned into the label's best-selling pop artist. He would eventually stack up more consecutive hits than the Beatles, get drafted, sing for the troops in Korea, come home, and land his own television show sponsored by Coca-Cola. Keep the origin in mind, because it's not a piece of trivia. The single most important event in Eddie Fisher's life was a piece of publicity that was presented to the public as an accident. The man Debbie Reynolds married had been made by the same machinery that would later make her a national martyr, run by the same person. They'd met around the studios and the nightclub circuit, and by 1954 something was happening. It was not, however, happening in a vacuum. Reynolds was being linked in the press to another singer, Bill Shirley, and Fisher's own memoir places his return to her life in that context, with his public relations people involved. He proposed at the Coconut Grove, the nightclub inside the Ambassador Hotel, in a room full of people who could be counted on to notice. Her romance with Shirley ended. The engagement of Debbie and Eddie became the biggest running human interest story in America. Was it real? Partly. That's the honest answer, and it's more interesting than either extreme. She was 22 and had never lived away from her mother. He was the most popular male singer in the country. They were photographed at Idlewild in April 1955, gazing at each other after flying back from England, where he'd played the Palladium and both had appeared before Queen Elizabeth. Maxine Reynolds came along on the trip as chaperone, which tells you exactly how much of this was youthful abandon. At the time, at least one scandal magazine ran the flat accusation that the entire romance was a publicity stunt and that the two of them had never been in love. A fan magazine columnist rushed into print to deny it, indignantly, personally, at length. Worth noting who was doing the denying. The fan press lived on studio access. Their business model was the myth. When the people whose income depends on a love story assure you the love story is genuine, you have learned something about the industry and nothing about the marriage. What's not in dispute is what the match was worth. Two publicity operations effectively merged catalogs. Her studio, which was watching its golden age fade, acquired the wholesome young sweetheart of American film with a romance attached. His managers acquired a clean-cut national fiancé for a singer whose entire brand was the boy your mother approved of. Newspapers got a serial. The public got a couple to root for. Nobody in that arrangement had any financial incentive to ask a 23-year-old whether she actually knew the man. They were married on September 26, 1955, and the location matters more than anything else about the day. Not Burbank, not a church of her mother's choosing. Grossinger's, the resort in the Catskills where Milton Blackstone had invented Eddie Fisher 6 years earlier. Her wedding took place on the site of his manufactured discovery. The ceremony itself lasted about 3 minutes and was performed by a county judge. The wedding ring came from Tiffany's, bought by Blackstone, who later told a reporter he'd purchased it under the name Henry Smith to keep the press off it, sizing it against a ring Eddie wore on his little finger. There was no time for the bride to buy her husband a ring at all. Eddie Fisher was married with a ring borrowed off a guest. Look at the arrangement plainly. The manager selected and bought the symbol under a false name, in secret, at the venue that had built his client. The groom improvised his half. The bride, who had lived under her mother's roof until that morning, got the wedding that the operation required. One headline the next day announced that America's sweethearts had tied the knot. The Saturday Evening Post would later call the whole thing the sweetest love story ever told, and mean it as a description of the marketing. They went into that marriage with the biggest publicity apparatus in the country pointed at them. What almost nobody outside the house understood was how little of the following 3 years they would actually spend in the same room, and what he was doing with the time. He was a touring act, and touring acts in 1955 were not home. He had a network television show every week, a recording contract that demanded product, and a nightclub circuit that paid better than either. She was a contract player at a studio that scheduled her by the day. Their calendars were drawn up by other people, in different cities, for different companies, and neither of them had the standing to refuse. So the marriage began as a logistics problem, and it never really stopped being one. The public didn't see that, obviously. The public saw a Christmas 1956 release called Bundle of Joy, a comedy the two of them made together about a baby, timed to the arrival of an actual baby. Carrie Frances Fisher was born on October 21st, 1956. The film is not good. It didn't need to be. It was the marriage sold back to the people who had bought the marriage, and it worked precisely because everyone already knew the off-screen version. Then came 1957, and something happened that would matter far more than anyone noticed at the time. Debbie Reynolds recorded a song called Tammy for a small picture called Tammy and the Bachelor. It went to #1 on the Billboard chart. Her name, not his. The wife of the biggest male vocalist in America outsold him on his own turf, in the same year that his television show changed sponsors and his chart position began sliding. Nobody in the couple's press coverage framed it that way. There was no reason to. But a marriage in which one career is rising and the other is quietly cresting is a different marriage from the one in the photographs. And the men around Eddie Fisher, the manager, the label, the network, were watching those numbers closely. Here is where the story gets uglier than the version America was given. And the source for it is the least flattering one imaginable: Eddie Fisher himself. In his 1999 autobiography, he admitted to a drug problem that ran roughly 40 years. It started with a physician named Max Jacobson, the New York doctor later notorious as Dr. Feelgood, who injected an enormous roster of famous patients with compounds that included amphetamines. Fisher wrote that the injections destroyed 30 years of his life. He was receiving them during his marriage. A man who is on stage, on television, on the road, and on Max Jacobson's syringe is not a man with much left over for a house in Los Angeles. He also gambled. He wrote about that too, and the line worth keeping is his own. He couldn't blame Mike Todd for leading him to the tables, and he couldn't blame Debbie because sometimes he stayed at those tables for hours rather than go be with her. He was running from himself, he said. That's a confession, and confessions against interest are the strongest evidence in this entire story. He is not describing a marriage that was broken by Elizabeth Taylor. He is describing a marriage he was already avoiding. Now, hold that beside what the wife was doing. By her own account in her 1988 memoir, Debbie Reynolds decided that a second child would fix things, and got her husband drunk in order to conceive one. That is her claim about herself, published 30 years after the fact, and it deserves the qualification, memoirs or arguments, and she had reasons to present herself as the one who fought for it. But it's not a flattering story to tell about yourself, and it fits everything else in the record. Todd Emanuel Fisher was born on February 24th, 1958. They named him after Mike Todd. Read that decision honestly. It is not the behavior of a woman in a happy marriage who wants another baby. It's the behavior of a woman who already understood, in 1957, that something was leaving, and reached for the only leverage her upbringing had taught her existed. And there were reasons she couldn't simply walk. She was 25, the property of a studio with morality clauses, and the sole commercial value of her image was wholesomeness. Divorce in that era ended careers for women far more reliably than adultery ended them for men. Her mother's religion had opinions, her own did too. She had 2 infants, a husband whose money moved through casinos, and a public identity that was co-owned by a film studio, a record label, and a television network. The exit existed on paper. It didn't exist in her life. She stayed. Then, on March 22nd, 1958, a private plane went down in New Mexico. Mike Todd was on it. He was 50, he had been married to Elizabeth Taylor for about a year, and he was Eddie Fisher's closest friend and something close to his idol. Taylor had stayed home with a virus. That illness is the only reason she wasn't on the plane. What the Fishers did next was decent and is often skipped. Debbie went to the house. She took in Elizabeth's children so the widow could get through the worst of it, and for a stretch of weeks she was looking after 5 kids while her husband spent his days at the Taylor house doing the consoling. She wasn't suspicious. Why would she be? He had loved Mike too. Grief in a small social circle looks exactly like grief. Their daughter Carrie later put it in one sentence, on a stage, decades on. Her father flew to Elizabeth's side and gradually made his way around to her front. It's the funniest line anyone has ever written about their own family's collapse, and it is also, structurally, accurate. By August 1958, the reports had started. Liz and Eddie, in New York, together. Columnists on both coasts were chasing it. The scene that broke it open, in Debbie's telling, is domestic and small. Elizabeth was in New York. Eddie was supposedly away working. Debbie was alone in the house with 2 babies and picked up the phone to call her friend at her hotel, just to talk, and Eddie answered. According to her account, she told him to roll over and let her speak to Elizabeth. She never claimed she said it bravely. She said it because there was nothing else available to say. That's the moment the marriage ended in fact. Everything after it is process. The moment it ended in public came on September 11th, 1958. Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist whose approval could sustain a career and whose disapproval could end one, got Elizabeth Taylor on the telephone and started transcribing. Hopper's opening was blunt. Level with me because I'll find out anyway. What's this Eddie Fisher business about? You're being blamed for taking him from Debbie. Taylor, who was 26 and 11 months a widow and had never been coached to lie politely, gave her the whole thing. She said you can't break up a happy marriage, and Debbie and Eddie's had never been one. She said Mike was dead, and she was alive. And then she said the sentence that followed her for the rest of her life. What do you expect me to do? Sleep alone? Hopper ran the story on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, and it went around the world. Here's the part almost nobody knows. By Hopper's own later account, she kept that famous line out of the printed column. She was so offended by it that she made sure the story ran everywhere. But the quote itself she withheld, and it entered public circulation later, through her, on her terms. The single most famous sentence of the biggest celebrity scandal of the 1950s was not in the article that detonated it. It was a private piece of ammunition released by a columnist who had decided which of these three people deserved destroying. That's worth sitting with. The public did not stumble into a verdict. A verdict was distributed. And it was total. Taylor became the husband stealer. Fisher became the deserter who walked out on a wife and 2 babies. The Fishers' friendship with the Todds, Eddie had been best man at their wedding, Debbie a bridesmaid, turned every photograph from the previous 2 years into evidence. Debbie's mother, Maxine, asked for comment, told the Chicago Tribune that Liz wouldn't get hurt because nobody could hurt her. Meanwhile, the wronged wife gave interviews on her own front lawn with her children in her arms. Photoplay put her on the cover late that year with a line that reads, "Today, like a confession of the whole industry's method." Smiling through her tears, Debbie says she's still very much in love with Eddie. That was published while she was declining, month after month, to grant the divorce her husband was asking for. Because that's the piece the sympathy story leaves out. She didn't collapse and sign. She refused. She told Pete Martin that it wasn't a new question Eddie had asked before, and she had said no. She held that no for roughly a year while the two of them conducted their romance in front of every photographer in the Western world. By the time she gave in, she had thought about how to give in. Flying home from filming in Spain, knowing there would be a crowd at the airport, she wrote out her line. The position she'd been placed in made it necessary for her to consent, but they would have gotten married anyway. That is not a heartbroken girl. That is a statement drafted to make the other party's behavior the reason for her decision, delivered at a location she knew would be photographed. Where does a 26-year-old learn to do that? She'd been doing it since she was 16, on studio-arranged dates for a publicity department. The machinery that had assembled her marriage was the only machinery she had ever been taught to operate. And in 1959, she picked it up and pointed it. The divorce came through on May 12th, 1959. Eddie Fisher married Elizabeth Taylor the same day, in Las Vegas, hours later. What happened to the three of them over the next 12 months is the part that should have told everyone what kind of story this actually was. His television show was canceled that year. He never had another hit of consequence. He'd been the boy your mother approved of, and the country did not forgive a boy who left 2 babies for the most desired woman alive. He went to the nightclub circuit and stayed there, more or less, for 50 years, turning slowly into a punchline about other people's marriages. Hers went the other direction, and the numbers are on the record. In the same 1960 interview where she described the diaper pins, the Post laid out the economics without embarrassment. The discarded wife's price per picture jumped to $125,000, then to $250,000. She signed a contract paying $1 million for 3 television appearances. Elizabeth Taylor's asking price ran from $500,000 to $1 million. The scandal didn't damage the 2 women. It repriced them. That is the sentence the sympathy narrative can't hold. America wept for a wronged young mother whose market value was rising every month. The weeping continued. None of which means the injury was fake. It means the injury and the strategy were happening in the same body at the same time, which is a thing people do. She told Martin that if she came through it, maybe it was because she never told an untruth, that whatever she said about her emotions was honest, and that she couldn't hide what she felt even when hiding it would have helped. Then, in the very next breath, she explained her method. She tried to say and do everything as she would see it 5 or 10 years later, rather than as she felt at the moment, because acting on the moment would have made her say the wrong things. Honest feeling, filtered through a 10-year edit. That's the whole woman in 2 sentences. And it's how a person can wear the diaper pins by accident and still know exactly what the picture is worth. Then the second act of her private life did to her what no gossip columnist could. In 1960, she married Harry Carl, a shoe company millionaire, a settled older man she believed would be a father to her children. He gambled. Over 13 years, he went through his fortune and then hers. And when that marriage ended in 1973, she was not a wealthy divorcee. She was a working performer with debts, taking Las Vegas engagements and touring shows because she had to. A third marriage in the 1980s ended in the 1990s in bankruptcy and a Las Vegas hotel venture that failed. Debbie Reynolds spent the second half of her life paying for men. She was clear-eyed about the pattern by the end, and in a 2015 interview she offered the version her husbands gave. That she wasn't a passionate woman, that she seemed more interested in raising her children than in pursuing her husband. She repeated their diagnosis without arguing with it, which is either humility or the deadliest thing she ever said about them. Eddie, meanwhile, was largely absent. He wrote it himself, and it's the single cruelest line in either of their books. He was their father only biologically. Family friends, including the actress Ruta Lee, have said the money simply stopped, that he sent nothing, and that it was frightening even for a woman who was a star. That's recollection rather than a court record, and it should be labeled as such. But he never disputed the substance of it. He argued about who deserved sympathy, not about whether he'd been there. Now watch what she did with all of it, because this is where the pins come back. While she was broke, Debbie Reynolds was buying costumes. When the studio she'd grown up in auctioned off its property in 1970, the dresses, the props, the physical evidence of the American movie business, she bought. She kept buying for decades, warehousing thousands of items nobody else wanted, spending money she frequently did not have, chasing a museum that never quite materialized. The girl who had been renamed and redressed and reinvented by a publicity department spent 40 years acquiring the physical remains of the machine that made her. And she wrote 3 books. He wrote 2, the second so explicit and so bitter that Carrie announced she was having her DNA fumigated. In his pages, Debbie is the iron butterfly, and the marriage is his grievance. Those books sold, briefly, and vanished. Hers didn't. She published in 1988 and again in 2013, at 81, still telling it, still funny, still the last word. There's a reason her version won that has nothing to do with fairness. She outlived the story. She kept talking for 60 years while everyone else got tired or got dead, and she was likable in a way that made the press keep coming back, which had been her one durable skill since she was 16 years old. Then she did the thing that finished it. In 1993, at an AIDS benefit, she went on stage just before Elizabeth Taylor and told the room that here she was, sharing something else with Elizabeth. The audience understood the joke instantly, 35 years after the fact, which tells you how permanent the story had become. The two women had reconciled by then. They'd known each other since they were teenagers at the same studio, and whatever the wreckage, that predated Eddie Fisher and outlasted him. In 2001, they made a television movie together called These Old Broads. Carrie Fisher wrote it. The daughter of the marriage wrote a comedy in which her mother and her former stepmother play women who share a contemptible ex-husband named Freddie and mock him. Debbie later said that during the production, Elizabeth told her, "I owe you a lot." Debbie said, it put a lump in her throat. Consider what that project actually was. The scandal that a gossip columnist weaponized in 1958 was, 43 years later, licensed content written by one of the 2 children who had been the props in the original photographs performed for laughs by both wives and broadcast to a national audience. Eddie Fisher, still alive, still writing books nobody read, was not consulted. He'd become a character in someone else's script. He died in 2010. Debbie Reynolds died in December 2016, one day after Carrie, having said she wanted to be with her daughter. So what was the marriage? Not a great romance ruined by a beautiful woman. It was a merger of 2 publicity operations that briefly contained 2 young people who liked each other, and it was mostly conducted in separate cities by a wife on a call sheet and a husband on a syringe and a card table. It lasted 3.5 years. It produced 2 children, 1 bad comedy, 1 #1 record that belonged to her alone, and 1 image that outlived every person in it. Which brings us back to the lawn. She said the pins were an accident, and she may well have been telling the truth about that particular afternoon. The photographers came to her house uninvited and caught her holding 2 babies she'd just changed. Fine. But she went back out to that lawn again, and again over the following months, children in her arms, and gave Interview after interview, and the pins are in the pictures. And she was a woman who had been trained since 16 to know precisely what a camera does with a detail like that. She also had a national magazine cover that season announcing she was smiling through her tears, published while she was refusing her husband the divorce he was begging for. The public thought it was watching a woman fall apart. It was watching a woman work. Eddie Fisher got the girl and lost the country and spent 5 decades explaining. Elizabeth Taylor got the man, kept him 4 years, and paid for that phone call for the rest of her life. Debbie Reynolds got the pins. She never took them off, and she never had to. She'd learned the trick from the same men who ran her wedding. The most convincing image in America is the one that looks like nobody arranged it.